And with that, I'll give a quick a, a, a quick introduction to so to Partha so Pandit. So he is a fifth year PhD student at UCLA. Is also currently and he's also currently intern at Amazon AWS and Amazon Search. So working on a bunch of stuff having to do with text generalization that's kind of combining together ideas from machine learning, statistics, information theory, and so forth. So is the so he's received the Jack K. Wolf Best Paper Award. So in a number of fellowships and scholarships, so today he's going to talk to us about characterizing performance of inverse problems over deep networks. So go ahead and we'll kind of jump into ask questions. Yeah. So great.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Jeff and Vivek, for having me here, and thank you everyone for attending this talk. Today I'll be talking about some work I've been doing for the last couple of years during my PhD, trying to work on some inverse problems related to deep neural networks. So can everyone see my slides? I just changed something. I just wanted to know that you can see my slides. Okay, great. So this is a fairly theory-oriented talk, and if you have any clarifying questions, please go ahead and ask them. So yeah, this is joint work with my lab mates, Mojtaba and Melika, and my advisors are Ali and Sandeep, and our collaborator, Phil. So it's really an understatement at this point to say that neural networks are everywhere. We've been working on problems which were initially toy models, like classifying cat images from dog images. And we've gone to somewhat more substantial tasks like AI assistants making reservations for you. And practically every publicly trading software company has incorporated some use of deep neural networks in their products today. But training and using deep neural networks remains mainly an art than a science. You require a lot of heuristic information and empirical observations that help you understand how neural networks work at this point. And as we go towards more safety critical applications like self-driving cars, which are pretty popular in the media right now, where a lot of the vision systems, for example, would involve pipelines involving deep neural networks. We want to get a better understanding of how deep neural networks work or why they don't work. And so we want to understand them so that we can trust them in such critical applications. And that kind of brings me to the kind of problems I'll be talking about today. So broadly speaking, I've been working on some estimation problems involving deep neural networks. These are, in some sense, inverse problems. So I'll be talking about two classes of problems. The first one is related to inference, where we assume that we're given a pre-trained deep neural network, and we're going to use this network in another downstream task, which involves a sort of inference. And the other type of problems we've been looking at is that of learning, which is learning slightly simplistic models when it comes to deep neural networks. So these are GLMs, one-layer networks and two-layer networks. And in each of these problem classes, we will be able to do some kind of average case analysis of the estimators that arise out of these problems. So average case analysis is one of the ways analysis can be done. especially in statistical estimation. And the idea is that whatever known quantities you have when you're trying to solve the problem, you assume that they come from a certain distribution. And as the problem size grows, can you get a characterization of the performance of your algorithm towards solving that problem? And so we'll be trying to come up with certain average case analyses for M estimators in both inference as well as learning. And this will involve coming up with some single letter formulae. So what are single letter formulae? In physical systems, for example, often you have the scenario that when you have a large number of degrees of freedom, the behavior of the system can be described concisely using some macroscopic descriptions. So for example, imagine a cylinder which contains a billion gas molecules, and each molecule has a position and velocity of their own, right? But you can describe the properties of this gas as a bulk quantity with macroscopic properties of the gas, such as pressure and temperature. And this is really meaningful information for an engineer who's trying to use this gas for some other task later on. So these macroscopic quantities capture the behavior of the gas or the system. Right? So in this case, our system is going to be the deep neural network. And we'll try to come up with such macroscopic quantities which are important for deep neural networks. Right? And the framework that we'll be using to do this analysis is a class of algorithms which is about 12 years old now, called approximate message passing algorithms. The unique feature about these algorithms is that they were designed keeping in mind that you want to do an average case analysis of the solution of the algorithm. And so I hope to get you excited about this class of algorithms. And yeah, so let's get started. So we'll start by looking at the first class of problems, which is inference problems. And let's look at a motivating example for inference problems. So suppose you are given the image of a human face, and it undergoes some kind of corruption through an operator A. And what you observe is the signal Y, which is the corrupted signal. And the task now is to perform inference on this observed image, which is Y, and you want to come up with an estimate X, which could give you Y as the observation when your corruption model is A, right? So in the inference problem, you assume that you know A and Y, and you want to estimate X hat, right? The way a human would solve this problem is to use some kind of preconceived notion of what a human face looks like. So there should be two eyes, one nose, two eyebrows, and some kind of symmetry in the face. And that is something we know from having seen thousands of faces throughout our life so far, right? But the way to model this mathematically is to say that your signal X comes from a distribution called the prior distribution, which is some function of X. And the signal Y was a sample from the distribution, which is the likelihood distribution, P of Y given X. And so using these two distributions, you can perform something what is called map inference, which is the mode of the posterior distribution. So P of Y given X is the posterior distribution, and you want to look at the mode of this distribution. So this gives you an optimization problem. And using Bayes' rule, the posterior distribution decomposes as a product of two distributions, which is the prior function and the likelihood function, right? There is a normalization factor, but it doesn't depend on X. So you don't need to worry about that, which is why map inference is more preferred than other inference techniques like MMSE inference, for example. Okay, so that brings us to the next question. What is a good prior for human faces, right? So if X is the signal, which is an image of a human face, how do you analytically represent a distribution over this signal space, right? So a lot of work has gone into designing such priors, and a lot of elegant ideas have come about in the last 30, 40 years in image processing, which try to model some kind of prior of this form. So ideas like sparse recovery or compressive sensing try to come up with some basis for this space of signals, such that the representation of most images of this type would have a sparse representation in that basis. Okay? More recently, about 5 years ago or so, a new class of prior models has come about, which is deep generative models. So what is a deep generative model? These are priors which are learned from lots of data in an unsupervised manner. And the idea is, simply put, that your signal X is the output of a function. Let's say the function is a deep neural network. And the input to this function is some simple random variable Z, right? So simple in the sense that it has a density which you can write in an analytic manner, something like a multivariate Gaussian or the Laplacian density, right? And so the idea is that as you change the source of randomness, which is Z, you would get a new image X, right? And you change the source of your randomness Z, and the network output would be an image, right? So this kind of, the network plays the role of restricting the output such that they are faces of humans in this particular example. Okay, so there are several ways of training G now, and over the last 5 years, a lot of research has gone into coming up with good loss functions to train these networks G. The most popular ones are probably the variational autoencoder and the generative adversarial networks, and most of the literature you would see would be some kind of a variant of these two techniques. Okay. And so once you have such a prior, how do you use this prior in your inference tasks? So that's what I'll be talking about next. So, okay, just as an aside, all these images are fake images. If you go to this website, thispersondoesnotexist.com, they'll generate a new fake human image for you, which is based on a GAN architecture, which was trained on some 200,000 high resolution celebrity images. Okay. Okay, so going back, how does a generative prior fit in the pipeline of performing reconstruction? So now we pose the problem as follows. The unknowns are X and Z, Z being the latent code of your generative model, and X is the signal. And now your map inference problem is the mode of the posterior P of ZX given Y, right? And so again, using the base rule, and you get this kind of a Markov decomposition into 3 terms. The first term, which is P of Z, is the prior, which we assumed had a simple analytic form. So we know how to write this as an expression. The second term is P of X given Z. This is something which is parameterized by the weights of the deep generative model G. And the last term remains the same, which is P of Y given X, which is parameterized by your transform A, which was performing the corruption, right? And so now we want to, this is a simple optimization problem, simple in the sense that you can write maybe 20 lines of PyTorch code and have an implementation for something like this. But analyzing the solutions that come about is difficult, and more so because the optimization problem is non-convex in nature, right? You don't necessarily have convexity in this optimization problem. And so we will try to come up with a technique to do analysis for this type of problems. Okay. So in order to do such an analysis, we will take a step back and look at this from a slightly abstract view. So this is essentially the same problem, but in a more abstract manner. So here is a stochastic neural network. The input to this network is the signal Z0, which was our latent code from the last example. This signal passes through the deep neural network, which is feed forward. And the output of this neural network is Y. Okay. And now the estimation problem is to estimate all the hidden activations of this neural network if you are given the output of this network Y and you're given the weights of the network. Right. So how does this? How do you apply this particular framework or abstraction to the previous problem? You can think of this quantity, ZL minus 2, as the image that you're trying to reconstruct. This can be your the A matrix or the operator which was performing the corruption, and this is some kind of a quantization on top of that. And the first half of this network is essentially the generative network G that we saw. And so we are trying to solve this problem as an inverse problem. So the forward model for this problem is that the density of y, or the likelihood function, can be decomposed as the following set of probability distributions, conditional probability distributions. So each term here in the product only depends on two consecutive activations and pre-activations in this deep neural network. And the structure is enforced using the prior function that you choose, which you had assumed to be simple, like a multivariate Gaussian or a Laplace distribution. And so going back, the map inference problem is essentially the same minimization problem which we saw. And instead of the prior, you see a negative log prior here. And this is now a sum of capital L functions, each of which only depends on two consecutive variables in this network, right? Writing the optimization problem in this way makes it easier to perform analysis and also to use ideas from ADMM to solve this kind of a problem. And that's the our algorithm will end up being a type of ADMM, and I'll talk about that later as well. So let's do some warm up and let's look at the case where L is equal to 1, which is we have just this model. Okay, so you have just one layer, which is a linear layer and no activation. You have y is equal to w z star plus some noise. The noise has a Gaussian distribution, and your input has the Laplacian distribution. Okay, so this here is the Laplacian distribution. W is a matrix of size n cross p, which is known. And we also assume, because we want to perform average case analysis, we will assume that the entries of W are random and are drawn from the IID Gaussian ensemble, right? So in this setting, the map estimation problem is essentially this problem here, which is the familiar lasso problem. And this is something that statisticians study all the time. So here are two competing algorithms for this problem. The first one on the left side is what is called ISTA, which is a very popular algorithm in sparse recovery. And the other algorithm is the AMP algorithm, which I'll explain is attractive for a very specific reason, right? So let's look at the iterations of ISTA. You have the term inside the function eta is essentially a gradient step from the current estimate z hat t. Okay, so R is the residual, and the quantity inside eta is one gradient step from the current estimate. And eta is the proximal operator. So ISTA stands for iterative soft thresholding algorithm. So eta is the soft thresholding operator, which is the proximal operator for the L1 norm penalty, right? So suppose you want to perform an average case analysis for ISTA. Let's just rewrite what ISTA looks like. Okay, so all I'm doing here is replacing RT with its expression from the second line.
So I'm guessing, so probably a good number of the audience doesn't know what a proximal operator is. So I was wondering if you mind just kind of explain that a little bit.
Sure. So a proximal operator is essentially the solution of a very specific optimization problem. This is a little difficult. I can try and use a pen. Okay, so prox of the L1 norm is a function, is an operator which applies on some variable u, and this is defined as the argmin over x of the function, which is the L1 norm, plus a quadratic penalty So this is the 2 norm. So this is called a proximal operator. And the way to think about this operator is that it performs a certain denoising operation. So if you're given u, which is a noisy estimate of x, then the prox of u is a denoised version of your estimate u.
So great, thanks. I think you did well with the pen too.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so how do I get rid of the pen? Sorry about that. Okay, yeah. So, right. So if you look at in this expression here, what I've written here is essentially I've just replaced the quantity r with what was on the second line, and the quantity y with what was on the true model here, right? And so if you rearrange the terms a little, you can write this as the sum of 3 quantities. The first quantity is z star. The second quantity is some multiplication of w with the noise vector. So this quantity ends up behaving like a Gaussian noise itself, because you assume that your original noise was also Gaussian. The third quantity, using some random matrix theory and the knowledge that your W matrix is from the IID Gaussian ensemble, you can also show that this quantity is behaves like a Gaussian random vector with a very specific variance and zero mean. Okay, so okay, this does not go away. Perfect. Yeah. So if you look at a typical entry of the vector z hat t plus 1, so this is a typical coordinate of this vector, then that behaves in a very peculiar manner. Zi star plus some Gaussian, additive Gaussian noise, which is scaled appropriately so that the variance is reflected in what was the variance of the term above. Okay. In doing so, however, we are assuming that the quantity which is I minus W transpose W is independent of ZT minus Z star. And this is not really the case in practice. But if it were the case, then you would be able to perform an average case analysis for ISTA as well. Okay. And so what is the average case analysis? You can, if you define the quantity tau t square as the mean squared error of the tth estimate of your optimization problem, then this quantity can be represented as an expectation over 2 random variables. Both the random variables z star and q are scalars. Z star has the Laplacian density with scale lambda, and q is the additive white Gaussian noise, the standard Gaussian noise. And the scaling for this noise is something which depends on the mean squared error of the previous estimate. Okay, so this would have been possible if your if this matrix here, I minus W transpose W, was independent of your current estimate Z hat T. But in practice, that is not the case. And you end up seeing that this quantity behaves in a very non-Gaussian manner. In fact, it has a mean which is not zero at all. Okay, and AMP essentially adds this additional red term to get rid of this nuisance in some sense. And so, what addition of this red term called the Onsager mean correction term does is that the input to your function eta, which was the proximal operator or the denoiser, is really a noisy version of your input of the true variable which you're trying to recover. Okay, so you can think of this as it modifies the input to a denoiser such that it does the denoising operation best, right? That's one way of thinking about this Onsager correction term. Okay, so with the addition of this Onsager correction term, you get exactly the same single variable iteration, which is that the mean squared error after t plus 1 iterations is given by a very specific expression which depends on the mean square error of the last iteration. Okay, and this is a scalar function, and you can evaluate this in closed form or using MCMC over the two variables q and g star. Okay, in this expression, beta is the quantity which is the ratio of the number of variables p to the number of observations, which is the number of coordinates in y. Okay, and in this analysis, because we are performing average case analysis, we are assuming that the problem size, which is n, is growing to infinity. Okay, so this is really the reason AMP is attractive, because you can perform this average case analysis, and it gives you exactly the mean squared error after t iterations. Okay, so just a quick note here: the quantity in this limit here is a random quantity which depends on the specific instance of the random variable w. Okay, but in the limit, because of a certain law of large numbers, this empirical average converges almost surely to a scalar constant. And this scalar constant is something you can calculate using the state evolution or this scalar iteration. Okay. Here we assume that the matrix W was IID Gaussian. So this is a slightly restrictive ensemble of random matrices. So there was a version of AMP called Vector AMP, which came out in 2016, which essentially extends the idea of this state evolution to a much broader class of matrices, which are called rotationally invariant matrices W. Okay, so what is a rotationally invariant matrix? It is so the singular values of an IID Gaussian matrix have a very specific spectrum, which is given by a law called the Marchenko-Pastur law. This is a very popular result in random matrix theory. But if you want to use the same machinery to other types of spectra for your singular values of the random matrix, then Vector AMP basically says that this idea holds for a much broader class of random matrices. And our algorithm is essentially an extension of Vector AMP to the case of L greater than 1. So far we've only been talking about the case of L equal to 1. And now we can talk about L greater than 1.
So can I ask a general question about the AMP algorithm? So,
sure.
So I've heard about this before, but I haven't seen the details. This is great. So is this, so is this kind of, does it work structurally different than the IST algorithm, which is a fairly standard, very old idea? Is adding this term kind of just like if you were to assume that there was that independence in the ISTA algorithm, or is this actually kind of, do you see fairly structurally different results when you run them?
So because the problem is convex, the solutions end up being unique. And so the problem here being, so if that's what you mean by structurally the same, yes, ISTA and AMP have the same fixed points, but ISTA has this nice interpretation that there are two steps happening. One is a gradient step where you're decreasing your objective function, and the other is a proximal step where you're decreasing the penalty in some sense. You don't still have the same interpretation anymore in AMP because you need not be going in the direction of the steepest descent. You might be going in a slightly different direction. So this is kind of like you're adding a momentum term here, which is changing the trajectory of the optimization algorithm. But the reason we are changing the trajectory is not because you want to converge faster or something like that. The reason is that you want to be able to predict the behavior of the algorithm as it proceeds through its iterations.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so let's go beyond the case of L equal to 1. So our algorithm is essentially multi-layer vector approximate message passing, which is a mouthful, to be honest. And the reason why this algorithm is nice is because it comes with this formalism of state evolution, which is an average case analysis. Okay, so if L is, so script, if this quantity small L is some intermediate layer, then and Z star and Z hat are the true variable and the estimate of your problem, then the empirical distribution of Z star and Z hat converge in distribution to two scalar random variables, capital ZL star and capital ZL hat, for wide random networks. So again, we are assuming we are doing the analysis in the limit where the random neural networks are growing wider in each of the problems we are considering, and the ratio of the width of the Lth layer to the width of the first layer or the input layer is some fixed constant beta. And this is really one of the macroscopic properties that that describes the behavior of the network. Okay, and this really is an important property because beta L is essentially characterizing some information regarding the architecture of your deep neural network, right? So how do you use such a result, which is that, so suppose F is a metric. So let's say F is your metric, which is your mean squared error. Then what our results show is that the mean squared error of the final solution can be calculated using an expectation over two scalar random variables. Okay. So let's quickly look at an example of this. So suppose you're interested in the following question. What is the average case mean squared error of reconstructing the first, the input layer of our problem? Okay, so recall that the problem was you have a deep neural network, you know the weights and you know the output, and you want to reconstruct all the hidden activations and the input of this network. So suppose your question was, what is the average case mean squared error of your input layer, and how does that change as you change the number of output neurons in this model? Okay, and your last layer also has a certain condition number, which is poorly conditioned. So it has a condition number of 10. So under all these assumptions, how does the average case mean squared error behave? So the green curve is what is the average case mean squared error according to our theoretical predictions. And then we perform the same experiment using a network of size of finite dimensions, essentially. So your input layer is of size 20, your hidden layers are of size 100 and 500, and you're changing the output layer because that's what you're interested in your experiment. And the behavior of the orange curve is exactly predicted as the size of the output layer increases. Okay, so the green curve is what happens when all the layers are infinitely wide, whereas for finite layers, our results are pretty close to what you see in practice, which is the orange curve. The blue curve was just a sanity check to see how Adam performs on this problem. And it appears that we perform almost as good as Adam in this particular ML-VAMP algorithm.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, please.
So I'm a statistician, so I'm not a computer scientist, but so as a statistician, we like to characterize uncertainty with, standard errors and confidence intervals and or, posterior intervals or something like that.
Right.
Can you use any of your results to say something about characterize uncertainty for maybe functionals of certain quantities?
Sure. So if you can write the uncertainty metric in the following form, which is applying element wise on the true solution and the estimate z hat, then you can calculate essentially the same. You can use the same machinery to come up with the limits of your uncertainty metrics.
Right, but that's just for so the almost sure convergence, right? But what does it say about distributional properties? Typically in statistics, right, things converge to multivariate normals, and stuff like that, and we use that approximation, right, to characterize uncertainty.
Right. So the deviation around this quantity is a little difficult to find out, and we still haven't figured out a way to do that. But yeah, that's something we are interested in. We just haven't figured out a way to do that yet. It's a good question.
No worries. Thank you.
One question. You mentioned the ISTA and the AMP. Can you kind of briefly go over, like, are there certain advantages and disadvantages between using those two?
So ISTA is nice because it has a lot of open source packages that you can use this algorithm in practice. AMP doesn't have such good implementations so far. Geometrically speaking, I think ISTA explores the geometry of the problem in a very systematic manner, which is it takes a gradient step and then does a soft projection. Whereas AMP doesn't really do that. AMP is more algebraic in nature. It takes a slightly different trajectory to reaching the same solution which ISTA would reach. So if you run AMP long enough, it would essentially reach the solution of ISTA. In practice, you see that both of these algorithms converge linearly to the solution.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so yeah. So I'll just skip some of this and go to some of the real world examples. So far we'd only been talking about some random neural network, but this is the comparison of our algorithm MLVAMP with ADAM for this particular in-painting problem. So you have the original MNIST digits on the first column. The second column shows the Y, which was what was observed. This is the occluded MNIST image. And we used we used ADAM to do the map inference as well as the MLVAMP to do the map inference from the same initialization or of the non-convex optimization problem. And we see that the solutions are qualitatively pretty similar. So there's no sleight of hand happening anywhere. And the advantage of VAMP is not that it's a better algorithm than ADAM. The advantage is that you can do average case analysis on the solutions of the algorithm. So that's what I wanted to show in this particular slide. I think I'll skip over some. So, okay, there is a whole bunch of theory about the algorithm, and essentially the algorithm just performs some kind of ADMM, which is called Peaceman-Rashford splitting ADMM. And I can talk about this offline if you're interested later. I want to get to the second class of problems which we are interested in, which is learning problems. So far we've been talking about neural networks where the weights were kept fixed. But what people are also interested in is how to learn a neural network and what are nice properties in data that can, and how do they affect the quality of the solution when you solve an optimization problem for learning. Okay, so we are considering three settings for the learning problem. The first setting is a GLM, which is the following settings. So you have some feature vectors xi, and they are Gaussian distributed, but with a non-trivial covariance matrix. Okay, and that your parameter is this vector w, and the output or the labels for your features are some scalar function of the inner product of the feature and the parameter, right? So this is the standard GLM, and one solution for this is to look at the M estimator, which is a regularized empirical risk minimization problem, which you see often in machine learning. So we consider W hat to be the solution of this particular optimization problem. So X is the matrix, is the data matrix with rows which are features, xi, and Y is the vector of all the observations yi. And so we are able to talk about the average case behavior of this estimator W hat using the state evolution formalism. And I'll share some plots and how accurate this looks. So here, I just wanted to point out that in our analysis, we don't need to assume that Fn and Fout are convex. So our analysis holds beyond convex functions and convex regularizers, convex loss functions and convex regularizers.
So how important is this assumption you're putting on the x's as being mean zero? That's not typical from a statistical perspective. We don't make that assumption, but here you are, and what role?
Right. So I think these are pretty. We can relax these assumptions a little, but just to keep the analysis simple, we've assumed it to be zero mean. The covariance matrix.
General, as a statistician, we don't typically place assumptions on the distribution of X.
Right.
When we do,
but we want to do a certain average case analysis, and that is really the reason why we are assuming this distribution.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we expect the results to hold to a broader class of distributions, which may have only bounded 8 moments or something like that. But right. Just to keep the
Sure, we would typically use the empirical distribution of X to do the average case analysis, as opposed to, assume some kind of normality.
Right. Yeah. So this is just for the sake of convenience right now.
No problem.
Okay. The next problem is essentially a one-layer neural network. So a GLM was essentially a one-layer neural network with the output neurons being just a single neuron, whereas a one-layer neural network in general can have multiple output neurons. So here we are considering a one-layer neural network with D output neurons. And essentially, we are learning the weights of the first layer. So that's the optimization problem we are considering. Again, F in and F out are not necessarily convex functions. They just have to apply row-wise on their arguments. Okay, so something like the L1 norm or the 2 norm squared, which are standard losses and penalties. Also, we consider learning in 2-layer neural networks or 2-layer ReLU network, which is also a slightly restrictive assumption that the weights of the second layer are known, and we're only learning the weights of the first layer. But this still gives us a non-convex optimization problem, and we can predict some behaviors of the estimator in the average case when your data is Gaussian distributed. So why is there a renewed interest in this problem? These problems seem simple. These models seem simple compared to the typical deep neural networks we see every day that we use. So this was something, the double descent phenomenon was something which was shown or examined in more detail in 2018. The phenomenon was probably first discovered sometime in the 90s. And the phenomenon is the following. So in this regime here, on this plot, the x-axis is the complexity of your model, and on the y-axis is your risk. So the classical wisdom was that when you increase the complexity of your model, your training risk keeps decreasing because you can fit the data well. and at some point, your test risk starts increasing because you start overfitting to the noise in your data. So this was the classical regime. But what was observed in practice is that deep neural networks were able to achieve a training risk which was 0. And they were also able to generalize well. So their test risk was also small. And so they were operating in a certain over-parameterized regime where essentially you have 0 training risk and a small test risk. And Belkin and co-authors showed that there are a lot of simple models that if you consider in the regime where the number of parameters is of the order of or larger than the number of samples that you're training over, then you again see the same behavior. So they considered models which were linear regression and many other simple one-layer neural network models. And they demonstrated that you can actually get the same behavior, which is you interpolate on all the data, but you still don't overfit. And so there has been a renewed interest in this problem. And over the last 2 years, a lot of papers have come out trying to identify these kind of learning curves, these kind of double descent curves in the over-parameterized regime for models as simple as generalized linear models, one-layer networks, and two-layer networks. And so our goal really was to come up with something which was general, and you can quantitatively come up with such over-parameterization training curves, learning curves, sorry. And so here is one learning curve that we plot. So let's just parse through what this plot is. This is the setting of linear regression with no regularization. So the 3 curves which are plotted are 3 different settings. So the blue curve corresponds to the setting where the features are uncorrelated. So your sigma covariance matrix is identity. The orange curve is when they are correlated. So there is some correlation between features. So some features are somewhat more important than others. And the third curve, which is the green curve, is the setting where you have correlated features in your training data, and your test data has a certain mismatch with your training data. And the test data also has some covariance matrix, which does not match with the covariance matrix of your training data. So that is the nature of the mismatch that we're exploring. The circles are what our experiments showed for some finite dimensional neural networks. And the bold curves are the predictions that we obtain using the state evolution formalism from approximate message passing. Okay, so we can obtain such curves for arbitrary GLM models, even those involving nonlinear loss functions. So for example, here the loss function is the squared loss function with some tanh penalty, the tanh function as the nonlinearity. And we see the same behavior, like we can predict very accurately in theory what you might see in practice, right? So this is a pretty powerful framework for analyzing the choice of your loss function, the choice of your regularization, and the strength of your regularization, and all these effects.
So can I ask a question on the previous slide? So you're talking, so it looks like I'm seeing the double descent curve here, which is
yes.
Yeah, so but you said this is for, so for linear regression, so is it, so I'm trying to understand where you're getting the over-parameterized. You're just in a higher dimensional space and you have number of data points, is that?
Correct, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so the x-axis here is the ratio of the number of samples to the number of parameters in the model. So on the left here, this would be your over-parameterized regime, and this would be your classical regime. And yeah, at the interpolation threshold, when the number of parameters is equal to the number of samples, you can exactly fit your training data. And what we're plotting here is the test risk. Okay. Yeah. And so, yeah, this basically opens a gate to analyze a whole bunch of design choices in learning your neural network, your single layer networks, as well as two layer networks. And yeah, so this is the result for learning a two layer network. The green curve is again the theoretical prediction that we obtain from the AMP kind of technique. And the orange curve is the result on a finite dimensional problem that we consider.
Excuse me. I wanted to ask, like, why don't we see a double dip phenomena in the last two figures?
Sure. So in these figures, we added a regularization term. We weren't really looking to bring out the double descent curve, but yeah. So if you don't regularize enough, you would see a double descent curve in these plots as
well. Okay, and there is a certain, if you go back to the that single curve in which you had shown on the slide 17. So I understand on the ones on the very right, like which have like sample ratio n by p close to 3, that is the under parameterized regime. But there should be something which should be decreasing as well, right? In the under parameterized regime as well. Like you start from the top, you take a dip, it then goes up, and then again it goes down.
Right. So if you keep doing it for if you look at this plot much longer, I'm guessing you would see a rise here again at some point.
Okay.
We were interested in the behavior close to the interpolation threshold, which is why the experiment is restricted only to this regime.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So again, we see the same behavior. These are non-convex optimization problems, and we are able to perform these analyses of test error or generalization error for solutions of non-convex optimization problems, which is interesting, and it gives pretty accurate results even for finite dimensional neural networks of what are not even large neural networks at this point. So 100 features is not a big network today. Okay, so the way we come up with these learning curves is essentially to pose the problem of learning as essentially the same kind of inference problem over a deep neural network. And the way to do this is if your data matrix X has Gaussian rows, then you can write that matrix as a product of two matrices, where the first matrix has IID Gaussian entries, and the second matrix is essentially the square root of your covariance matrix. And after doing some SVD kind of decompositions, the map from your true matrix, true vector W star to your observations Y can be written as a sequence of rotation matrices and element-wise operations. And so your optimization problem, which was the minimization problem we considered here, this problem or any of these problems can essentially be written in a form which is like this. And so we can use ideas from MLVAMP, and the state evolution can be used to derive such curves and get a handle on the average case behavior of the solutions of the problem. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop here. I think I'm also out of time. So yeah, thank you.
Super, thank you. So I'll clap for everyone, I guess. So I'm sure everyone's loudly cheering at home. So great. So if anyone
Thanks,
else,
Alex.
If anyone has questions,
another question.
Now's the time.
I have another question.
Hi, Dai.
So for the image, I noticed you mentioned about the image reconstruction thing. I have a question about that.
Sure.
So do you think, like, with this image reconstruction thing, that we can use it to help like historians regenerate like lost pictures, or like help police like regenerate like photos of suspects that they can't clearly see the face of?
Yes, I think a lot of this is actually being done today. I don't know about the police thing, but these kind of problems related to inpainting have become very popular in the last 5 years or so, and this area has seen a lot of interesting applications come out of it as well. Things like de-blurring, denoising kind of problems have been solved using such reconstruction techniques. And there's a whole bunch of literature related to reconstruction with generative priors. Yeah.
The very last thing is, do you think, is it possible, you think one day that we can generate like the faces of like people that from history that we don't know what they look like? Do you think one day that's possible?
I guess, yeah. I mean, I'm a very optimistic person myself, so yes, I think that is possible. I don't know how one would go about doing that, but yeah, I think.
So like, if we wanted to like generate like a picture, like what, like I don't know, George Washington really looked like, or something like that.
Yeah, I wouldn't know how to pose a problem of this sort. But I'm guessing you would use some kind of information related to how their ancestors look. And yeah, this is an interesting question. I haven't thought about this. But yeah, I'm inclined to say that yes, you might be able to do something like that.
Could you talk a little bit? So in the beginning of the talk, you mentioned a lot about kind of risk analysis and the usage of these more complex architectures and things where we need some sort of way of quantifying risk, such as like self-driving applications. Could you touch a little bit more on the big picture follow through of how VAMP starts to cross that bridge and make those analyses more realistic?
So that's a nice question. So one question that comes up when you look at this particular diagram is the architecture of this neural network G here, right? So you see some deconvolution layers and some convolution layers.
Oh, I don't think you're sharing screen anymore. Maybe not. Sorry.
I think Jeff, you're muted if you're saying something.
Yeah. So I can still see it. Probably when you move to another thing to raise your hand,
okay.
It's on full
screen.
So
I hope you can see this. I think it was Greg who asked the question.
It's still visible.
Okay, so
yeah, all good. Sorry about that.
Okay, so you can see the architecture of this neural network G here, right? And the kind of question that puzzles a lot of engineers is, how did someone come up with this complicated architecture? And VAMP can hopefully give us a handle on how one can choose these architectures. What are some useful properties of this network G that you should be looking for when training such a network? So things like should your distribution of singular values of these transforms be heavy-tailed, or should they be low rank in nature? And all these kind of design choices can probably be affected if we know more about how these design choices are changing the behavior of the problem that we're interested in. And so VAMP really is just a framework to help engineers do this kind of an analysis. Yeah, this is probably a few years out though, but yeah, so that's something definitely we should be looking towards, doing an analysis of networks which go in production. I don't think that is done well enough today.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much. Appreciate the talk.
Thanks.
So maybe Abhinav had his hand up.
Yes, I do. So I had one question regarding when you showed the reconstructed images. Where we had MNIST images. Yes. Yes. So here it seems like the sharpness seems to be an issue. compared to MapAdam, and I feel like it's a like the blurriness is similar what you would see in a VAE kind of method as compared to a GAN kind of method here. So could you replace this VAE and with something else, or maybe you try something else to recover anything very sharp?
Yeah. So, like you said, VAEs do end up having such blurry outputs, or generators or decoders of VAEs usually end up having such blurry outputs. Whereas GANs would probably give you something more sharp. So all we use here is a network G, right? So this network G can be trained in any manner. If we had trained the G using a GAN, probably we would have seen something more sharper. But yeah, that's something which needs to be investigated in more detail. I don't know much about GANs and VAs personally. I just use off-the-shelf solvers for training such networks G.
And another question was, like you showed us the analysis, and most of the times the analysis ran through like a fully connected or the linear layers, right? And because you use W transpose something, but for the G's we generally use deconvolutional layers, which are so like does this analysis carry forward to the convolutional and deconvolutional as well?
So the analysis if you run a simulation, you would see that the prediction by the state evolution is exactly matching what you see with a convolutional neural network as well. But we still don't have a rigorous theorem which proves that. For fully connected layers, we at least have a theorem which proves that. But yeah, that's something we've been looking at, and yeah, it's a little tricky. But this phenomenon of the state evolution seems to be more universal than just for random matrices.
Okay. Yeah. Got it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
So I've got a question as well. So,
sure.
So if you go back, you're talking about trying to recover these spaces, and one of the known kind of concerns with this is that these sort of approaches don't necessarily, they're often trained on faces that look maybe a lot like mine, but not necessarily someone from a like minority class, and so if you don't have this in your, or if you're not sure if your training data had enough coverage of a certain area and if it's going to do some sort of poor prediction, could you modify the initial, think of modifying the initial distribution or something in your analysis to kind of do a kind of some sort of preemptive understanding of how well it would work on a certain category without trying from some limited number of examples? Or is this going to have an advantage over actually getting the sorts of examples you want to test and just seeing how well it works on those? Like how would you, does you allow to generalize beyond that better? Yeah, if you can say something about that, I'd be interested here.
Yeah, so what the kind of question you're talking about is your data itself has a mismatch between your training and test distribution in some sense. And so we need a better understanding of how this mismatch would affect the reconstruction quality in some sense. We don't really have a good handle on how to even formulate this problem mathematically, I guess. The closest we've been able to come so far is to just assume that there is a mismatch in terms of the covariance structure of the matrix. So if you look at the green curve here, the assumption is that there was the test sample was from a distribution which was Gaussian but had a different covariance structure than the training samples. And so you see a gap between the recovery or the generalization error of your network just because of some mismatch. So these networks are not really robust in that sense, or they were not trained to be robust in that sense. So maybe a good way to analyze this is to say that, even when you have this kind of a discrepancy between your train and test distributions, can you make the test error be close to the test error if there was no mismatch? And for that, you need to maybe add some robustness penalties in your regularization, or these are some very important questions, and I don't think we have been thinking about them enough to have a good grasp on how to even formulate them mathematically.
So great, thanks. So is there another question?
I had another one as well. Sorry about that. So,
No problem. Go ahead.
we have been like studying all the way like about the average case behavior, but in general, in from a signal processing perspective, people have been also looking into the L infinity perspective, like basically how much maximum error we could make, or what's the like.
Right.
So, do we have any some results on the like the max error as well?
Right. So if you look at this particular slide here, I stated the result in terms of a general metric F. Now, if you consider your metric to be the infinity norm, your result here would depend on the infinity norm between the random variable ZL star and the random variable ZL hat. So you can do an analysis in the infinity norm sense as well.
Okay.
So as a theoretician, we don't really know what kind of errors or metrics that the people who are interested in applications are interested in. So we try and state the results in the most general metric F form, which sometimes becomes hard to relate with. So yeah, this framework, this machinery holds for a much broader class of metrics. And yeah, you can apply it to practically any performance metric and get such average case behavior.
Okay, yeah, I missed this part actually, like where what's F doing that?
Sorry, I zoomed through this pretty quickly, so sorry about that.
Yeah, thank you.
So great. So if we don't have any more questions, so let's thank Partha again for the great talk. This was
thank you so much. Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah. So so thanks a lot. So and then everyone else, will see you again next week. Same time, same channel.